On a humid July evening in 2005, 8-year-old Clara Boudreaux vanished from a dirt path leading toward the Louisiana bayou. Neighbors believed she had wandered too far. By nightfall, search parties combed the reeds with flashlights and dogs. Nothing was found except a patch of torn fabric, sealed quickly in a plastic bag. In the absence of answers, fear took hold. Families whispered of spirits said to roam the swamp at night, spirits that claimed children who strayed. For years, the case remained frozen in silence, filed as another mystery swallowed by water. Until, decades later, a sealed courtroom exhibit, a flashlight still streaked with mud, was pulled from storage, reigniting every rumor and every scar. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The summer heat pressed hard on the parish roads, heavy and unmoving. Cicadas droned from the cypress trees, their rhythm so constant it became background noise. By late afternoon, the light over the Louisiana bayou had turned the color of rust, hanging low, pooling shadows between wooden porches and sagging fences. It was the kind of evening when time itself felt slow, when neighbors drifted toward their doorsteps to wave and gossip, and children ran barefoot down sandy tracks before supper. Clara Boudreaux was 8 years old, small for her age but quick, always darting ahead of her cousins when they played along the edges of the swamp. At 4 p.m., she asked her mother if she could walk toward the bayou path behind their house, the one shaded by overgrown cane. It was a familiar route, no different from dozens of evenings before. Her mother hesitated, then nodded. The child slipped outside, leaving the screen door banging gently against its frame. Inside the kitchen, a silver flashlight lay on the table. It was small, palm-sized, its casing still polished from little use. Clara's mother had set it out earlier in the day, meaning to check the batteries before storm season. She would remember that detail later, the way the object had waited there, unused, as if it already carried some hidden weight. Neighbors recalled seeing Clara pass by the road, ponytail swinging, shoes kicking up dust. Some thought she was humming to herself. Others could not agree on the exact time, though everyone settled roughly on the late afternoon. By 6 p.m., when the supper bell rang from the small Baptist church nearby, the child had not returned. Her mother went out to the porch, scanning the track, calling her name into the rising chorus of insects. There was no answer. As darkness came on, worry replaced routine. Word spread quickly through the cluster of homes. Men pulled on boots, women grabbed candles and flashlights, and children were ordered to stay indoors. By 8 p.m., groups were moving down the path toward the swamp, their beams of light slicing through reeds that stood taller than any man. The searchers called Clara's name into the dark, and each call seemed thinner than the last, swallowed by the water and night air. Police arrived before midnight, taking statements under the harsh glow of a floodlight hauled out from the back of a cruiser. An officer logged the time Clara was last seen according to the community hall's clock, a round face mounted over the door, hands set just past 4. It was not proof, but it became the first line in an official report. Several neighbors contradicted each other about what Clara wore, about whether she had been alone. The contradictions piled up quickly, leaving investigators with more fog than clarity. At the water's edge, a deputy marked a spot where the mud had given way, a shallow depression near the footbridge. It could have been any child's shoe or nothing at all. The bayou had a way of making illusions, ripples disguised as movement, shadows mistaken for form. The flashlight beams trembled over the black surface, but revealed nothing beyond reeds bending in the breeze. Clara's mother stood on her porch through the night, porch light burning, hands clasped together as if holding herself in place. Inside, the silver flashlight remained where she had left it. It was not used during the search. Its switch was still off, its battery untouched. That quiet fact, later written in the margins of a report, would linger like an unanswered question. By dawn, the searchers returned exhausted, mud streaked to their knees. They had found nothing but silence. The swamp gave back no sound, no movement, no trace of the child. Neighbors drifted home, whispering to one another words they would not repeat to police. about old spirits in the bayou, about debts never repaid, about a woman in white who had been seen before. The case began not with a body or a crime scene, but with an absence, with an open path swallowed by reeds, and a girl whose name carried into darkness without reply. The bayou swallowed her laughter whole. By nightfall, the parish had turned restless. Cars lined the dirt road leading toward the swamp, headlights aimed at the reeds as if light itself could summon Clara back. Men carried lanterns, women held candles wrapped in glass jars, and children were kept behind locked doors. The heat had not broken. The air was dense, filled with the buzz of insects and the croak of frogs deep in the water. Groups spread out with flashlights, voices overlapping as they called the girl's name. Some shouted, others sang soft hymns, their words dissolving into the night. Every few minutes, a light beam would cut across the path and then disappear into the tall grass, swallowed instantly. Search dogs were brought from the next parish, their handlers urging them forward, but the animals grew anxious, whining at the edge of the bayou as if unwilling to cross. It was in that tension, between hope and fear, that stories began to take form. A boy no older than 12 swore he had seen Clara walking with a woman in a white dress just before sunset. He said she was smiling, holding hands with the figure. Adults hushed him, dismissing it as imagination, but the rumor spread quickly from one cluster of neighbors to another. Some shook their heads in silence. Others murmured that the old legends of the bayou might not be only stories. Deputies focused on the practical. They cordoned off the path, noting where footprints had softened in mud. Near the footbridge, a scrap of fabric was found, torn and streaked with damp earth. It was sealed in a clear bag and labeled with the time, 11:45 p.m. The item was held under a flashlight for the mother to view. She could not be certain. The color looked familiar, but night had a way of distorting shades. The swamp itself seemed to resist the search. Lights flickered in the mist, bouncing off water and vanishing just as quickly. Searchers reported hearing splashes in the distance, though none could agree on direction. Some claimed to hear a child's laughter echoing, thin and high, but when they moved toward it, the sound fell away into silence. A group of older men paused near the crossroad where the track forked. They turned off their flashlights and let their eyes adjust to the dark. In that silence, one swore he saw a pale figure drifting between the reeds, not walking but gliding, dissolving when beams of light struck. The others said nothing, but each carried the image home, repeating it in whispers until rumor hardened into memory. At 2 a.m., the sheriff ordered the search halted until morning. Volunteers stood in clusters, reluctant to leave. A few lit candles in paper cups and set them by the water, a small ritual passed down from their parents, meant to guide lost children back from the swamp. Others made the sign of the cross, muttering that such offerings were dangerous, that they invited more than they repelled. When the searchers finally dispersed, the road fell silent. A few beams still probed the reeds, wavering and weak, before flicking off one by one. The only sound left was the low hum of the swamp and the steady drip of water falling from leaves. On the kitchen table of the Boudreaux house, the silver flashlight remained untouched. Its switch was still off. The pale figure flickered across the swamp lights. By the following morning, the town carried a heaviness that clung to every surface. Doors creaked open slowly, curtains stayed drawn, and conversations were hushed. Where ordinary gossip might have filled porches and corner stores, only one subject remained. Clara Boudreaux was gone. The official search had yielded nothing. In that vacuum of answers, belief began to rush in like water through broken levees. At the edge of the bayou, neighbors had already begun building a makeshift altar. A flat plank balanced between two cypress roots became the table. Candles were set down, their wax pooling and hardening in the morning heat. A schoolmate of Clara's brought a doll, its hair tangled, its fabric limbs stained from years of play. She placed it beside the candles with a trembling hand. Someone else tied a ribbon around a branch, and another left coins pressed into the soft mud. The altar grew quickly, transformed from ordinary objects into offerings, each meant to appease or summon depending on who was asked. Whispers traveled faster than the sheriff's deputies could write reports. Some claimed a woman in white had been seen again, this time crossing the old wooden bridge at dusk. Others told of a shadow that stood at the far bank, watching silently as the searchers passed. It was said the swamp kept its debts, that children who ventured too far were taken in exchange for something long forgotten. Such talk flourished in the absence of evidence, feeding on fear, shaping itself into a narrative the town could cling to. The deputies tried to hold focus on what they could touch, what they could bag and tag. At 10:03 p.m. the night before, the parish dispatch had logged a call from a payphone at the highway junction. The voice was described as hoarse, almost cracked. The words were simple. The child crossed. Then the line went dead. The number could not be traced further. The call was marked as a lead, but with no witness attached, it slipped quickly into the haze of speculation. Harker, the journalist who had arrived from Baton Rouge, kept to the edges, filling his notebook with details. He wrote down times, overheard descriptions, the exact placement of candles at the altar. What struck him most was not the absence of Clara, but the presence of ritual. He had covered other disappearances, but here the community seemed to fight with two languages, the language of police reports and the language of folklore. Each detail existed in both realms at once. A footprint was evidence to the sheriff, but an omen to the man who had seen it dissolve into water. The doll placed on the altar became the center of attention. Children whispered that its eyes had changed overnight, that one button eye now looked darker than the other. Some adults laughed nervously, while others crossed themselves, unwilling to dismiss the possibility. By evening, the doll had swollen with moisture from the swamp air, seams loosening, fabric sagging, as if the object itself resisted being left in that place. One woman swore she had seen smoke rising from the reeds, though no fire was lit. Another said she heard humming, a lullaby, low and distant, vanishing when she turned her head. Each story added a new layer to the myth, until it became impossible to separate what had been seen from what had been repeated. Harker visited Clara's mother, who sat at the kitchen table, the silver flashlight still beside her. She had not moved it. She said she could not bring herself to switch it on. "If I turn it on," she told him, "and the light fails, then I'll know she's not coming back." The sentence was written in his notebook exactly as she said it, a line that blurred between grief and ritual. That night, more candles were lit at the bayou edge. The children who had been kept inside the day before peered out from windows, watching flames bend in the humid air. The sheriff's men stood nearby, uneasily allowing the vigil to continue. It was easier to let the town have its rituals than to fight them. One deputy muttered that such gatherings spoiled a crime scene. Another said there was no scene left to spoil. As the night deepened, a breeze rippled across the swamp. The candles wavered, wax dripping down to the plank. The doll shifted slightly, falling onto its side, half its face pressed into the damp wood. Someone whispered that the spirits had accepted the offering. Others quickly straightened the doll, afraid to leave it in that position. For Harker, the image was indelible. A flashlight set on a family table, never used. A child vanished into reeds. A doll now soaked and sagging on a plank of wood. Each object carried weight it had not been designed to hold. Each one had become a symbol, suspended between myth and fact, between memory and evidence. The sheriff ended the vigil just after midnight, ordering everyone home. The altar was left behind, candles extinguished by the deputies. The doll remained, wet and unblinking, its button eyes catching the last sweep of flashlight beams. When the area emptied, the swamp swallowed the silence again. The night seemed unchanged, but something lingered. An impression, a suggestion, as if the ground itself had absorbed the whispers. No child was found, no figure in white revealed, no trail followed beyond the mud. What endured was the rumor, repeated with more certainty than any report. Clara had crossed. Whether into the arms of a spirit or into something darker, no one could yet agree. The doll's eye filled with swamp water. Daniel Harker arrived 2 days after Clara's disappearance, notebook tucked under his arm, camera slung across his shoulder. He had covered small-town tragedies before, runaway teens, factory accidents, sudden drownings. but something about the calls he had received from this parish intrigued him. Reporters spoke of contradictions, of neighbors whispering two different stories at once. The official version pointed to a child missing in the swamp. The unofficial version spoke of something else entirely. The morning he stepped off the bus, the town felt suspended. Posters with Clara's picture were already taped to the windows of gas stations and nailed to telephone poles. Children's handwriting scrawled the word missing in crooked letters. He stopped to jot down how the posters seemed to ripple in the humid wind, paper already curling at the edges as though time itself wanted to erase them. At the sheriff's office, he asked for the public report. The deputy behind the desk handed him a thin folder, a few statements, a sketch of the path to the bayou, and a log of collected items. The official story was bare, clinical. Time last seen, 4 p.m. Location, bayou path behind Boudreaux home. Evidence, 1 scrap of fabric, 1 partial footprint, 1 anonymous call. Harker noted the emptiness as much as the content. He left the office and walked down to the water's edge. The swamp was as still as a held breath, the air heavy with rot and bloom. Near the footbridge, he noticed candle wax hardened against the planks, small puddles where vigil flames had stood. He snapped a photo. In the reeds nearby, he found what looked like the crushed remains of paper cups. Rituals left their traces even when extinguished. While he stood there, a group of men from the town passed by. One pointed at the bridge and told a story. A fisherman had seen Clara cross it just before sunset, but she wasn't alone. She had been holding someone's hand. Another man scoffed, saying no such thing had happened, that fishermen told stories to cover the fact they had been drinking. Their argument turned sharp, then faded as they walked away. Harker wrote a single line, 2 versions of the same bridge. In the afternoon, he found himself outside a weathered shack belonging to a man named Amos Gautreaux. Locals had already whispered about him. Amos lived alone, rarely spoke, and sold catfish at the market without ever looking people in the eye. His yard was filled with drying nets and strings of fish bones left hanging from nails, clattering whenever the wind picked up. Children crossed the road rather than pass his fence. When Harker approached, Amos stood in the doorway. Thin frame, clothes stained with years of labor. He didn't invite him in, but didn't send him away either. Harker asked if he had seen Clara. Amos shook his head once. His eyes slid past the reporter toward the swamp, as though something there demanded his attention. The rumor about Amos had taken on its own life. Some said he was seen by the bayou the night Clara vanished. Others claimed he spoke to spirits, that the bones in his yard were not only fish. The sheriff's men had questioned him, but he had no vehicle, no record, no reason to suspect beyond his strangeness. Still, whispers spread. If the spirits hadn't taken Clara, maybe Amos had. Harker scribbled in his notebook. Folklore needs a vessel. When spirits are doubted, the outcast becomes the vessel. He turned back to the official notes. Among the documents was a log entry about footprints. Small impressions likely from Clara, and larger prints partially overlapping them, heading toward the bridge. Rain had blurred the edges before they could be cast. The entry concluded, indeterminate origin. For the sheriff, it was a dead lead. For the town, it was proof of a presence beside her. That evening, Harker sat on the Boudreaux porch. Clara's mother clutched the silver flashlight in her lap, turning it over but never switching it on. She told him she had left it on the kitchen table, meaning to check its batteries. Now she kept it near as though light itself might still bring her daughter back. Harker noted the way the object shifted, once practical, now talismanic. The town's altar by the bayou had grown since the previous night. Bottles of oil, crosses made of twigs, scraps of fabric tied to branches. When Harker photographed it, a woman told him not to linger. If you stand too long, she warned, you invite them to notice you. He asked who they were. She only shook her head. Later, while reviewing his notes, Harker saw the dual stories forming. On one side, the sheriff's thin file, times, evidence, logs. On the other, whispers of women in white, of outcasts watched by shadows, of offerings placed in mud. Both layers existed at once, woven together, impossible to fully untangle. He knew his task would not be simply to record facts, but to trace how rumor and record collided in the same place, each reshaping the other. When darkness fell again, he walked once more to the bridge. The water was black beneath, carrying faint reflections of the moon. In the mud near the edge, he found what looked like the fading print of a child's shoe, smaller than his hand. Next to it, deeper, broader, was a partial impression that sank into the wet earth. He leaned closer, shining his light. The shape dissolved into water, edges collapsing, leaving no clear outline. He raised his camera, but by the time the shutter clicked, the mark was gone. What remained was only the sound of the swamp, patient and unbroken, as if it had been waiting longer than any searcher could imagine. One footprint ended where the water deepened suddenly. The Boudreaux house sat low to the ground, wooden steps sagging with age, the paint long since stripped by weather. Each morning, Clara's mother rose before dawn, but now she had no rhythm. She sat at the kitchen table with a pen, marking heavy black lines through each passing day on the church calendar tacked to the wall. The ink bled where her hand shook, making crooked slashes that cut through saints' feast days and Sunday reminders. Harker wrote in his notes, grief measured in ink. Neighbors dropped off casseroles wrapped in foil, but few stayed long. The air in the house felt heavy, filled with an absence that pressed on everyone who entered. A child's toys remained in a corner, lined up in neat rows Clara herself had arranged. Her shoes still sat by the door, laces knotted, as though waiting to be pulled on again. The town itself was splitting along fault lines. Some gathered at the church to pray, insisting faith would bring truth to light. Others huddled by the bayou altar, burning candles and whispering names. The sheriff called it distraction. To many, it was the only action they had left. Between those poles stretched an uneasy silence, broken only by rumors. Late one afternoon, a woman stopped Harker on the street. She was pale, breathless, and said she had seen Clara inside the small chapel at the edge of town, kneeling near the front pew. She swore it had been just 2 nights earlier. When pressed, she admitted the figure had not turned its head, and she could not swear it was truly Clara. Still, the claim spread like wildfire. By evening, people were lighting candles at the chapel doors, convinced the girl was trapped between worlds. The sheriff dismissed it, sending deputies to search. They found nothing but dust and hymnals stacked in neat rows. Harker photographed the chapel anyway. When he developed the shot later, the only anomaly was a silver flashlight hanging on a nail inside the doorway. No one could explain how it had gotten there. The batteries were corroded, the lens fogged. To some, it was proof that spirits had carried objects as signs. To others, it was nothing but forgotten clutter. Meanwhile, the official search continued in fits. Deputies canvassed nearby roads, stopping cars, knocking on doors. One lead surfaced about a white truck parked near the footbridge the day Clara vanished. The description was vague, the plate unreadable. A composite sketch was drawn, though most said it could resemble half the men in town. Still, it became another piece of the fragile puzzle. At night, Harker sat with Clara's mother on the porch. She held the small silver flashlight, the one from her kitchen table, rolling it between her palms. She confessed she had begun speaking to it, whispering prayers as if the object could transmit them into the swamp. Harker didn't interrupt. He only noted how a simple household item had become charged with desperate meaning. Rumors multiplied faster than the sheriff could control. Some claimed Clara's laughter had been heard by the levee. Others insisted an old woman living deep in the swamp had taken her as payment for debts unknown. The sheriff warned the town to stop spreading stories, but his voice carried little weight compared to the pull of fear and tradition. The calendar on the wall at the Boudreaux home grew darker with every passing day. Lines crossed lines until whole weeks were blotted out. One evening, as Harker studied it, he noticed a stain spreading across the page. At first he thought it was water, but when he touched it, the ink smeared into his fingertips, leaving them black. He wiped his hand on a napkin, unsettled by how the marks looked more like bruises than spilled ink. That same night, the chapel was visited again. This time, a group of teenagers sneaked in, hoping to see the girl or her ghost. They claimed the air inside was freezing despite the heat outside, that a single candle lit itself near the altar. None of it appeared in Harker's photos, yet the story spread faster than his articles ever could. By dawn, more people gathered, some praying, some simply watching. The sheriff tried to redirect attention back to tangible leads. He organized another search near the bridge, pushing through reeds waist-high, mud sucking at every step. Deputies carried evidence bags, but brought back little. The white truck remained a rumor, the chapel sighting just another echo. Only the calendar and the flashlight seemed constant, repeating like refrains in a song no one wanted to hear. Harker wondered aloud whether the very act of searching in this town was reshaping reality. Each rumor created its own evidence. Each ritual summoned a new object to the story. He wrote, "Fact and faith colliding," leaving no clear witness between. That evening, Clara's mother marked another line through the calendar. The ink pooled and ran, a black stain dripping down to the date below. She pressed her hand against the paper to steady it, leaving a faint print that blurred beneath her touch. The calendar's ink blurred like blood in rain. The abandoned fisherman's warehouse stood on the far edge of town, half swallowed by vines, its tin roof warped and rusted. Children dared each other to enter even before Clara's disappearance, but now it loomed larger, whispered about as a place where spirits gathered. When the sheriff announced that deputies would search it, the news traveled quickly. Some neighbors nodded in relief. Others muttered that entering such a place risked stirring things best left alone. Harker joined the search party as they pried open the warped door. The hinges screamed, and the smell of mold hit hard. Inside, dust swirled in beams of weak sunlight that broke through holes in the roof. Nets lay in heaps along the floor, brittle and stiff. In the far corner, against the wall, were chalk drawings, childlike figures, stick people with round heads and arms stretched wide. At first glance, they looked innocent, like doodles scrawled in boredom. But there were dozens, layered over one another, crowding the walls until the space seemed to echo with unseen children. One deputy crouched down and touched the lines. "Fresh," he muttered. The chalk had not yet faded, suggesting the marks had been drawn recently. The sheriff marked the wall with tape and ordered photographs. To the deputies, it was evidence. To the neighbors who had followed the group, it was proof of haunting. Someone whispered that the children's spirits had tried to leave a message, frozen in chalk where no one would erase it. Near the center of the room, a deputy's flashlight caught on something small. It was a length of tape stuck to the floor, brittle from age. Curled inside it were strands of hair, light in color. The evidence was sealed quickly. Weeks later, laboratory results would confirm what the sheriff feared and the mother already knew. The hair matched Clara's DNA. For the moment, though, it was only another fragment, pulled from the dust of a ruin. The townspeople who gathered outside watched uneasily. Some clutched rosaries, others crossed their arms tightly, whispering that the warehouse had always been cursed. An elderly woman declared that a child had drowned years ago near the docks, and that the place had never been cleaned since. Harker scribbled down her words, noting how folklore rushed to fill the void around every forensic clue. In the back of the warehouse, Harker noticed something else. Half buried under broken planks was a small silver flashlight. Its casing was cracked, its bulb missing, as though it had been snapped in anger. He picked it up carefully with a gloved hand offered by a deputy. Mud still clung to its surface. Another object for the log, another entry in a growing chain of symbols. To Harker, it felt as if the flashlight had shifted again, from household tool to ritual object to something darker, evidence discarded in haste. That evening, the warehouse became the talk of the town. Some insisted the chalk drawings were Clara's, a final message. Others claimed they were the work of spirits, a crowd of lost children marking their presence. The sheriff said nothing publicly, but Harker caught a glimpse of his face when the DNA result came back days later. The grim confirmation settled over the department like a stone. Still, no one knew who had brought Clara there or why she had been taken from the path toward the swamp. The red herrings multiplied. Some accused the reclusive fisherman again, pointing to nets and bones found nearby. Others returned to the tale of the woman in white, convinced she had guided Clara into the warehouse only to vanish again. Each rumor grew louder, each forensic trace twisted to fit the legend. Harker walked back to the Boudreaux home to deliver what little he could. Clara's mother sat at the table, the original flashlight in her lap. When she heard about the broken one found in the warehouse, her grip tightened on the object she still held. "Not hers," she whispered. "Clara never carried one." Her certainty unsettled Harker. The more evidence surfaced, the less it seemed to align with what the family knew. At nightfall, the warehouse stood locked, yellow tape across its door. But candles still appeared at its threshold, placed by hands unseen, their flames trembling in the humid air. To the town, the building was now more than abandoned. It was shrine and crime scene, both at once. Inside, the chalk figures lingered. Their arms reached outward, stick forms fixed in endless repetition, as though calling for someone who would never return. A chalk line broke at the locked door. By the end of the week, rumors tightened their grip on a single name: Earl Duval. He lived in a clapboard house set back from the road, shutters closed even in daylight, yard overgrown with weeds that swallowed the fence. He had worked odd jobs years earlier, but had slipped into solitude, rarely seen except at the corner store where he bought coffee and cigarettes. For some, that was enough. Outsiders always carried suspicion, and Earl had long since been pushed to the margins. When Harker asked about him, neighbors dropped their voices. They said Earl kept a table of bones in his kitchen. They said he walked the swamp at night, muttering to himself, carrying jars that glinted in moonlight. One woman insisted she had seen him place candles by the riverbank long before Clara vanished. Each rumor piled on the last, until Earl became less a man than a shadow where fear could settle. The sheriff, pressed by the community, sent deputies to question him again. Earl answered the door after a long pause, his frame tall but stooped, eyes sunken. The living room smelled of dust and something sharper, herbs drying on strings above the windows. In one corner sat a table with jars of feathers, bottles of oil, and a cross carved from driftwood. Harker, invited inside reluctantly, noted the strange mixture, part folk ritual, part simple clutter of a man living alone. Earl spoke little. He denied seeing Clara. He denied walking the bayou that night. His voice was steady, but his hands twitched as he lit a cigarette, the ash trembling onto the floorboards. Deputies asked if they could look around. He shrugged, muttering that he had nothing to hide. In the kitchen, Harker's attention fixed on an object resting neatly on a shelf. A silver flashlight. Its casing polished, batteries fresh. Unlike the broken one recovered from the warehouse, this flashlight gleamed, almost too new, as though it had been purchased recently. One deputy lifted it, clicked the switch. A sharp beam cut through the dim kitchen, freezing against the jars and feathers. The room fell silent, every eye on the light. The deputies logged the flashlight, along with receipts found in a drawer, tape, candles, batteries, all dated within a day of Clara's disappearance. None of it was illegal, none of it proved guilt, but together they formed a troubling pattern. Outside, the neighbors who had gathered watched as the deputies carried items to their cruiser. To them, the sight confirmed what they already believed. Earl had taken the girl. The spirits had used him as their vessel. Harker, scribbling notes, marked the moment when rumor and evidence seemed to collide. Yet he also noticed cracks. Earl's yard was littered with neglect, yet the flashlight was pristine. His shelves were cluttered, yet the receipts were organized, stacked in sequence. Too neat, Harker thought, for a man otherwise careless. He wondered if the appearance of order had been staged, or if it had been forced into the story by those determined to find a culprit. That night, talk spread faster than the deputies could contain it. People said Earl had been caught performing rituals in his yard. Others claimed he confessed to voices in the swamp. None of it was in the official log. But by dawn, the town had convicted him in whispers. Harker returned to Earl's house for one last observation. Through the window, he saw the man sitting alone, cigarette ember glowing in the dark. On the table before him sat another jar, this one filled with feathers and scraps of cloth. The silver flashlight was gone, taken as evidence. In its place was only shadow. For Harker, the image captured the essence of the case. A man framed as monster, objects that shifted meaning depending on who looked at them, and a child still missing. Whether Earl was guilty or merely convenient, the story had already claimed him. The flashlight beam froze on feathers and jars. The warrant came at dusk, stamped and signed, the ink still wet. Deputies moved quickly, not only to secure evidence but to calm a town that had already made its judgment. Earl Duval stood on his porch as the cruisers rolled in, shoulders slumped, cigarette burning low between his fingers. He did not resist when the sheriff read the order. "Do what you need," he muttered, voice flat as gravel. But inside, the house smelled of stale smoke and damp wood. The deputies fanned out, opening drawers, lifting rugs, photographing every corner. Harker followed at a distance, careful to keep his role as observer, though he felt the weight of the community pressing through every open window. Neighbors had gathered outside the fence, whispering, craning their necks for a glimpse. In the back room, under a pile of blankets, a deputy pulled free a small cloth doll. Its button eyes were cracked, one hanging by a thread. The fabric was damp, as if it had been pressed into wet ground before being hidden. Gasps sounded when it was carried through the hall. Another deputy opened a trunk and found children's clothes folded roughly, sizes too small for any adult. The sheriff's jaw tightened as each item was cataloged and sealed in plastic bags. On the kitchen counter, a dark stain spread across a rag. Under forensic light, it showed traces of blood. The sample was swabbed, marked, and bagged. Later, tests would confirm it matched Clara's blood type. For the deputies, it was enough to tighten their suspicion. For the neighbors pressing closer outside, it was the verdict they had been waiting for. But something unsettled Harker. He noticed how the items had been tucked away without care, almost as though placed for discovery. The doll, the clothes, the rag, they felt too obvious, too staged. He wrote in his notebook, evidence arranged like props in a play. Whether Earl had left them there or someone else had, the effect was the same. In the living room, a deputy lifted the silver flashlight. It had been left on the shelf where Harker had seen it before. Battery still strong, it clicked on easily, its beam cutting through the dim air. The light swept across the jars of feathers, freezing on a crucifix made of driftwood. Some muttered that it was more ritual than religion. Others said it proved Earl's obsession with symbols. The object, once ordinary, now seemed to glow with accusation. Earl sat in a chair, wrists bound loosely, eyes fixed on the floor. When asked about the doll, he said nothing. When pressed about the blood, he exhaled smoke and stared into the corner. To every question, he gave the same answer: "Not mine." Outside, the crowd grew restless. Children clung to their mothers. Men muttered about justice. One woman shouted that the spirits had spoken, that the guilty man was finally revealed. Deputies hurried to load the evidence into the cruiser, their flashlights bobbing through the dusk. Harker lingered at the threshold. He looked back into the kitchen and saw the silver flashlight still in the deputy's hand, its beam growing weaker as the battery drained. The light sputtered once, dimmed, then steadied again. For a moment, it seemed almost alive, struggling to stay lit. He jotted down the detail, knowing it would haunt his notes as much as the doll's sagging eye. The search concluded with bags of evidence, boxes sealed and labeled. Earl was led out past the crowd, his head lowered, smoke curling from the last drag of his cigarette. No one shouted, but the silence felt heavier than words. The town had already decided. The law, for now, was simply catching up. That night, Harker returned to his rented room above the diner. He spread his notes across the bed. The doll, the clothes, the stain, the flashlight. Each item carried weight, yet none answered the central question. Rumor said Clara was still alive, held by spirits deep in the swamp. Evidence said she had been here, in this house. Between those poles, the truth seemed to flicker, unstable as failing light. When he closed his notebook, the image stayed. A child's doll with one blind eye, staring into darkness that refused to give anything back. The doll's button eye stared through cracked cloth. The bayou gave back what it had taken on a gray morning, nearly 2 weeks after Clara's disappearance. Rain had fallen through the night, and mist clung low to the water. Deputies slogged through knee-deep mud, pushing past reeds that whipped against their arms. The sheriff had ordered a final sweep of the cypress groves, determined to close the loop on the search. It was a deputy at the rear who saw it first, a strip of plastic sheeting tangled among roots. He shouted, his voice cutting through the silence. When the others gathered, they pulled at the nylon, and what came free stopped every movement cold. Inside the plastic lay the small body of a child, wrapped tightly as though someone had tried to hide her beneath the swamp's surface. The current had shifted overnight, carrying the bundle against the roots until it snagged. The sheriff's hands shook as he called it in. Harker, standing at the edge, scribbled only 2 words. She surfaced. The discovery broke the balance between rumor and fact. Whatever the spirits of the bayou were said to hold, this was now a crime scene. Deputies marked the area with tape, though the swamp refused containment. Water seeped over boots, reeds swayed, and insects swarmed even as photographs were taken. The body was lifted carefully, placed in a sealed bag, and carried toward the waiting van. The mother, kept away at home, would be told by a deputy chaplain. Forensic teams arrived from Baton Rouge. They noted the condition of the plastic, the knots tied roughly, the position of the body. Tests later confirmed what the swamp had tried to erase. Clara had died the night she vanished. The timeline aligned with the anonymous phone call, the footprints by the bridge, the fabric scrap found in mud. Pieces that had seemed like fragments now aligned with grim precision. Among the reeds near the site, another object was found. It was small, cylindrical, coated in muck. A deputy rinsed it in swamp water until the shape emerged. A silver flashlight, casing dented, mud packed into the switch. Its serial number was etched faintly on the bottom. Bagged, tagged, it became Exhibit 47 in the swelling case file. When news reached town, the effect was immediate. Some wept openly, mourning the girl they had prayed for. Others hardened, voices rising that Earl Duval had brought the body here. Rumor did not vanish with discovery. It twisted, adapted. Some whispered that the spirits had released Clara only to condemn the guilty. Others said the swamp had merely revealed what it could no longer keep. Harker walked the length of the bridge that evening. Candles had been placed along its rails, their flames bending in the damp wind. He jotted down how the ritual persisted even in the face of confirmation. Myth and evidence did not cancel each other. They grew together, feeding the same hunger for meaning. The sheriff held a press conference in front of the courthouse, the silver flashlight displayed on a table beside sealed bags. His words were clipped. Evidence had been found. The investigation was narrowing. He avoided Earl's name, but the implication hung in the air. The townspeople needed no further cue. By nightfall, Earl's windows were shattered by thrown rocks, and his name was hissed like a curse on every corner. In his rented room, Harker arranged his notes. He wrote, "Fact has arrived, but belief refuses to leave." The flashlight, once just an object on a kitchen table, had become the case's anchor, first ordinary, then ritual, now artifact. Its light no longer mattered. It was the silence it carried that told the story. As the swamp quieted, the weight of certainty settled in. Clara would not come home. The story was shifting from search to judgment, from whispers to charges. Yet the bayou still loomed, holding its secrets just beyond reach, as if daring anyone to claim they understood its depths. Her small shoes were found nearby, separate from the plastic sheeting filled with water and reeds. One lay upright, the other tilted on its side, soles heavy with mud. The sheriff ordered them collected, but the image lingered long after the bags were sealed. Her shoes surfaced, soles filled with swamp water, The courthouse in St. Martin Parish filled before dawn on the day of the hearing. Wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of neighbors, reporters, and relatives who had come to see justice delivered. Fans rattled overhead, stirring humid air that carried the faint smell of rain-soaked clothing. At the front, a long table bore the objects that had come to define the case: the doll with its cracked eye, the fragments of tape and fabric, and the silver flashlight tagged with Clara's number. Earl Duval was led in under guard, wrists shackled, head bowed. He wore a faded shirt too big for his frame. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some calling him a monster, others only staring. The sheriff sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, jaw set, his notes stacked in order. Across from him, Earl's court-appointed attorney shuffled papers nervously. The proceedings opened with the evidence. A forensic specialist described the DNA match between Clara's hair and the strands found on tape in the warehouse. Another explained how the blood sample in Earl's kitchen aligned with Clara's type, the probability statistics recited in calm, clinical tones. Photographs were projected against the courtroom wall: the chalk drawing, the nylon-wrapped body, the muddy shoes. Each image pulled a gasp from the benches, but it was the flashlight that held the room. A deputy placed it on the stand, its casing dull under fluorescent light. He explained where it had been found, how its surface bore prints too smudged for identification, how the mud inside its switch confirmed it had been submerged. The item was passed across the courtroom, lifted by gloved hands, then placed gently back into its bag. It was ordinary, but in that moment, it radiated something heavier, an anchor of guilt. When the prosecution rested, the defense rose. Earl's lawyer spoke of thin evidence, of community bias, of folklore woven into fact. He claimed the doll and clothes could have been planted, that the receipts were circumstantial. Then he raised the final red herring, the fisherman. He argued that Amos Gautreaux, with his solitary ways and bone-littered yard, had been too quickly dismissed. He pointed to conflicting eyewitness accounts, to the rumor of a woman in white. "This case," he said, "is built not on certainty, but on shadows." The room stirred. Some nodded, uncomfortable. Others hissed, unwilling to hear alternatives. Harker, seated in the back, scribbled in his notebook, "Defense leans on doubt, but doubt cannot outshout grief." When Earl took the stand, he spoke little. He denied everything. He said the flashlight was not his, that the doll had never been in his house, that the blood was a stain from an animal he had cleaned. His voice was steady, but his eyes avoided the jury, flicking instead toward the floor. The prosecution countered with a sequence of receipts: tape, candles, batteries, all purchased within a single day, the very day Clara vanished. One by one, the items were held up. Ordinary purchases, transformed by context into weapons of implication. By the second afternoon, the jury had heard enough. Deliberation took less than 3 hours. The courtroom filled again as the foreman stood, paper trembling in his hand. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. The words settled over the benches like a closing door. Clara's mother wept silently, her hand clenched around a handkerchief. As the verdict was read, a deputy clicked on the silver flashlight one final time, demonstrating how it still worked despite its damage. A white beam cut across the silent courtroom, striking the wooden wall, steady and unbroken. For a moment, no one breathed. The judge nodded, ordered the item sealed again, and sentenced Earl Duval to life imprisonment without parole. The gavel struck once, hard, echoing in the still air. Harker watched as Earl was led away, chains clinking against the floor. He wrote, "Justice delivered in paper and light, but doubt lingers in shadow." The silver flashlight, logged as Exhibit A, was placed back in its clear bag. Its beam faded as the switch clicked off, leaving only silence. The light clicked on in the silent courtroom. The trial ended with a life sentence, but closure was harder to come by. The courthouse emptied, benches scraped, and the townspeople spilled into the square with a mixture of relief and unease. Some said justice had been served. Others whispered that the spirits of the swamp would never allow peace. Earl Duval was gone, locked behind iron bars. Yet his absence seemed only to thicken the air around the bayou. Weeks later, Harker visited the sheriff's office to view the evidence log. The binder lay heavy on the desk, pages stiff from humidity. Line after line described objects reduced to catalog numbers. Exhibit 34, nylon wrapping. Exhibit 47, silver flashlight. Exhibit 52, doll with button eyes. Each entry carried dates, signatures, chain of custody notes. It was a language of procedure, stripping meaning from objects that had once glowed with dread. In the evidence room itself, shelves stretched under fluorescent light. Boxes were stacked, labeled in black marker, their contents hidden in clear bags. Harker paused at the row marked with Clara's name. Inside a sealed pouch, the doll sagged in fabric silence, button eye cracked but intact. Next to it lay the church calendar, pages stiff with dried ink, lines slashed across the days. And beside them, wrapped in plastic, rested the flashlight. He leaned closer. Even through the clear bag, the object seemed diminished. The casing was dulled, scratches along its side, mud dried in its grooves. The switch sat in the off position. For all its ordinariness, it held more weight than anything else on the shelf. This was the tool that had traveled from kitchen table to altar to crime scene to courtroom. Now it was evidence, waiting quietly behind glass. The sheriff entered, his expression hard. He said the case was closed, the conviction secure, but admitted in a low voice that something about the evidence felt staged. "Too neat," he muttered, echoing Harker's own thought from months earlier. Still, he shrugged. Court doesn't care if it's neat. Court cares if it holds. In the parish, the rituals had not stopped. Candles continued to appear by the bayou, set in neat rows that the deputies kicked over and removed. Within a day, new ones would take their place. Children tied ribbons to branches, convinced Clara's spirit still lingered in the reeds. Her mother, though, refused to speak of spirits. She kept her porch light on every night, not for myth, but for memory. Harker attended a Sunday service at the Baptist church. The preacher spoke of justice delivered, of sin punished, of closure. But his voice wavered when he mentioned Clara's name. Many in the pews bowed their heads, while others exchanged glances, as though doubting whether human courts had settled anything at all. In his notebook, Harker wrote, "Conviction does not erase myth. Myth grows around it, feeding on silence." He realized the story would not fade. It would linger in two forms: the legal record of a crime and the whispered tale of a child taken by the bayou, her light extinguished by forces unseen. The evidence room stood as the stark reminder. Harker returned one last time before leaving town. He watched as a deputy logged the items again, checking tags, resealing bags. The flashlight was lifted briefly, its switch pressed to confirm it no longer worked. No beam emerged. The deputy shrugged, wrote "inactive," and placed it back into storage. Harker imagined the object years from now, dust settling on its casing, its story half remembered, half believed. Forensic exhibit to some, cursed talisman to others. Both truths could coexist, locked together in silence. Behind glass, the flashlight waited in silence. Years passed. The courthouse files yellowed, the reporters moved on, and new cases filled the parish docket. But the story of Clara Boudreaux never truly left the bayou. It lingered in the way parents called their children inside before dusk, in the candles that still appeared at the water's edge, and in the whispered warnings traded across back porches when the air grew too still. Daniel Harker returned on a summer anniversary, his notebook worn. The ink faded from constant handling. He stepped off the bus to find the town smaller than memory, its roads more cracked, its porches more weathered. Yet the atmosphere was the same, thick, suspended, as if time had not moved forward since the night Clara vanished. At the sheriff's office, the evidence room had shifted locations. Steel shelves now filled a windowless annex, the air dry and humming with fluorescent lights. Harker signed the visitor's log and was led down the aisle where boxes bore names and numbers. Clara's file sat midway down, unchanged. The deputy on duty lifted the bagged items one by one. The doll, limp and dust-specked, its eye still cracked. The church calendar, edges brittle, ink lines dark and permanent. And at the end, the silver flashlight. Its casing had begun to tarnish, streaks of rust creeping from the seams. The switch no longer moved easily. When pressed, it gave no spark. The deputy jotted, "Degraded," resealed the bag, and slid it back onto the shelf. Harker leaned against the cold steel rack and wrote in his notebook. Symbol drained of light, yet heavier than before. Objects that had once passed through so many hands, that had shifted from ordinary tools to cultural tokens to courtroom artifacts, now sat inert. Yet their weight had not diminished. If anything, time had charged them further. Outside, he walked to the bayou. The water glistened in patches of sun, reeds bending with the breeze. Children rode bicycles along the dirt track, their voices bright but careful. At the footbridge, wax stains still marked the planks. Fresh ribbons fluttered from branches, tied in neat knots by hands unwilling to let go. The altar had collapsed years ago, but its memory lived in these smaller offerings. An older woman passed by carrying a basket. She paused, looked at the ribbons, and muttered, "Some debts don't end." Harker wrote it down. He realized the line could serve as the story's epitaph, truer than any verdict. As dusk fell, he stood at the edge of the water. The cicadas began their relentless hum, and frogs called from the shallows. The air thickened with the smell of rot and bloom, the same as the night Clara had vanished. He thought of her mother, who still left the porch light on, a vigil for a child who would never return. For Harker, the case had always been two stories, one written in police reports, the other whispered through ritual and rumor. Both had run their course, colliding in a courtroom, then diverging again. He understood now that closure was not a single line, not a gavel strike, but a haunting that repeated itself with each retelling. He closed his notebook, but the images remained. The chalk figures on the warehouse wall, the shoes filled with swamp water, the doll's blind eye, and above all, the flashlight. First on a kitchen table, then on an altar, then under courtroom lights, and finally behind glass, silent and rusting. An object that had carried memory further than any testimony. The bayou darkened quickly. Candles flickered along the bank, their flames bending in the humid air. Some believed the light guided spirits home, others believed it kept them away. Either way, the ritual continued, as though the swamp itself demanded it. Harker turned back toward the town, the sound of cicadas fading behind him. He knew he would carry the story long after the evidence rusted away. In the bayou dusk, no light could be trusted.